So thank you everyone for joining us today for the second session of the winter season of GEPIC seminars. And to begin, I would like to provide a brief overview of the GEPIC project, which frames the seminar series. So the Gender Empowerment Through Politics in the Classrooms, GEPIC, is a third-year initiative funded by the European Commission, active across 6 European countries: Belgium, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Spain, and the UK. GEPIC's goal is to conduct research in secondary schools, specifically with second-year students, to identify effective classroom practices that help develop students' confidence in expressing their opinions and engaging civically. And of course, the project emphasized a special interest on empowering young girls at the start of their secondary school journey, supporting them to build confidence in their voices and perspectives. And now I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker. So Dr. Kelly Siegel Stechler is a senior researcher at the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, CIRCLE, at Tufts University. She's primarily focused on projects that advance civic learning and development in K-12 education, as well as questions related to youth political and electoral engagement. Before joining CIRCLE, Kelly received her doctorate from Johns Hopkins University School of Education and worked in educational programming and youth outreach and engagement at the Interfaith Center of New York, the Louis August Jonas Foundation, and the United Nations Foundation. So thank you very much, Kelly, for your time, for connecting with us for this seminar.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'll get my screen going. It's not giving me a preview of which screen is the right one, but I have 3, so hopefully this is the right one.
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Great. So I'm going to share a little bit about a recent paper that I have in Theory and Research in Social Education. And I'll just give you a quick overview here. I'll start with a little bit of background and conceptual framework, talk about the study itself, and then some of my findings, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So I do want to situate this study in context, which is part of my larger PhD dissertation work, which was focused on this concept of open classroom climate, which is really this idea that it's the extent to which students experience their classrooms as places to investigate issues and explore their opinions and those of their peers. And the focus of my dissertation work was really on this yellow triangle here that you'll see, which is really about how the choices that we make in teaching social studies impact the kinds of climate that students experience in the classroom. In part because we know that this last piece, the civil tolerance and political engagement, having a climate that students experience as open in their classrooms has all of these really positive outcomes in terms of democratic participation and attitudes and sort of their overall citizenship development. So that's kind of the context in which this study takes place. This is the qualitative piece of that work. It was a mixed method study. And it's really focused on this core conceptual framework that I'm using to think about the kinds of approaches teachers use in their classrooms in their teaching, right? So I have these 2 sort of concepts, a liberal framework, which is about really giving students access to traditional languages of power, right? Making them able to navigate the status quo in existing institutions. It usually goes along with social constructivist pedagogies that are focused on sort of teacher and student being in conversation and students in conversation with each other. And traditionally, it sort of focuses on these concepts of rationality and neutrality, the ability to have conversations that are reasonable, where multiple perspectives are seen as equally valuable, and students are able to sort of remove emotions and sort of focus on a rational argument in the classroom. This is contrasted with a radical approach, which is more sort of in line with a Freirean thinking about education, where students are learning to critique current power structures. It tends to go along with critical liberation pedagogy, and it tends to subvert traditional hierarchies of the roles of teacher and student in the classroom, where everybody is a learner and all knowledge is sort of shared and co-created, and tries to privilege alternative ways of knowing and experiences, not just sort of these traditional teachers have all the answers, they know how the world works. And they're sort of the sage on the stage approach to education. So the current study that I'm talking about comes from this qualitative work that I did in the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, which originally had these two sort of core research questions driving it. Number one, how are teachers trying to create environments that encourage open discussion through the pedagogical choices that they're doing and the teacher moves they make in the classroom? And then secondarily, how do students perceive those actions? And how is that perception reflected in their experiences of classroom discussion? If you are not familiar with Miami, my slides aren't advancing, hold on. Still hear me? Oh, I'm frozen. Okay, here we go. If you're not familiar with Miami-Dade County Public Schools, Miami is a city in Florida in the southeast corner of the United States. And it's an extremely diverse city. It tends to be a real gateway city in the United States. There's a very large immigrant population, especially from all across Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America. And because of that, Miami is also very politically diverse. Florida is often seen as a swing state in US elections, meaning there's kind of just about as many Democrats as Republicans, conservative and liberal folks living there, as well as these large immigrant populations, many of them naturalized citizens to the United States, many of them still undocumented, right? And so you have this sort of big confluence of different cultures and races and ethnicities living in the city together, which gives you a lot of opportunities to see really varied demographic contexts and different kinds of school experiences that students are having there. So my school sample comes from 3 classrooms in different schools across Miami. They're sort of a big traditional high school, US high school, where Miss Iodele had a dual enrollment international relations course. So these were sort of more talented students who had the opportunity to take like a college level course in high school. But overall, the school had sort of middling performance on math and ELA tests. 90% of students qualified for free or reduced lunch. That's like a US context that we use to measure poverty. And then it was a predominantly Hispanic population with a pretty large Black population as well, about 20% of students. Tech prep is sort of this high achieving boutique sort of high school in downtown Miami, where Miss Cohen was teaching advanced placement US history. So this is again a college level course in a US high school. And then Global Magnet is sort of in the middle of those two things. It's a more diverse population, sort of more mid-range in terms of student ability or achievement on tests, and kind of a more middle-class magnet program. So these are the 3 different contexts that we're in. Both Miss Iodele and Miss Cohen had been teaching for quite some time. Mr. Castile, who was teaching at Global Magnet, is more of a newer young teacher, but they come from very different backgrounds and sort of different approaches to thinking about teaching. So I'll talk through the 3 sort of case studies from these classrooms that I'm pulling from, and then get to the sort of overarching themes of the research. So I looked at 3 case studies of specific instructional practices that are kind of thought of as best practice, student-centered opportunities for engagement in the classroom. So we had a simulation, a debate, and a discussion research roundtable. So I'm going to start by highlighting some findings from each case and then dig into some overarching takeaways. So the first is this congressional hearing simulation at Central High. And one of the small ways that the teacher here, Ms. Iodele, tapped into radical frameworks was by occasionally subverting hierarchies and power dynamics in the classroom and centering students as experts and herself as the learner. So, for example, she tended to flip traditional roles of teachers and students by displaying humility about both her teaching and her knowledge of the world and the validity of her students' opinions and experiences. She actively solicited feedback from students after every discussion activity and genuinely took to heart student input about their learning, comfort, experiences in the classroom, and tried to apply those things to her own teaching. This was an ongoing practice in her room, and we have sort of a snapshot of how she conducted those kinds of conversations in the simulation that's highlighted in this vignette. Second, I observed a research roundtable discussion at Global Magnet. And in this classroom, both the students and the teacher were attentive to one another's emotions and affect throughout the lesson, offering support and working together to create a positive classroom environment for taking risks and exploring different perspectives together as a community. Part of this included a pretty remarkable exchange where a student felt unprepared and uncomfortable, and their fellow students jumped in to support them and offer encouragement. So you can see I have a little snapshot of this exchange here where Mr. Castile, Brandon, Eric, and Valeria are talking about, giving the student encouragement to participate. And then afterwards, Valeria was talking about this with me when we had a discussion group after the class, and she said, today she was like, she didn't want to say, she was kind of scared. And their teacher responded by saying, it's okay, it's going to be fine, you can be wrong, right? And this kind of sense that they're trying to care for and create space for one another's feelings and fears was really a core feature of this classroom and the community that existed in it. And then finally, the next case was a fishbowl debate at Tech Prep. And sort of how it related to students' feelings about their ability to disagree openly. Students in this classroom reported that disagreeing with one another was awkward, but not necessarily because the environment was bad. And so as a result, they tended to use humor as a coping strategy to deal with that awkwardness, but also to signal to their peers that they were all sort of in it together, they were feeling the same way, and that they were still on good terms, even as they were disagreeing and not taking things too seriously. And a lot of this seemed to be so that their disagreement and competition that they experienced in the classroom didn't spill out into their lives at school more broadly. As a result of this, they tended to engage in what I've termed performative or often hyperbolic disagreement, using phrases like boom or wow to sort of punctuate their sentences and create a sense of separation between their actual selves, their actual beliefs, and the need to create conflict in the context of a debate. The fear and conformity that gets talked about in this classroom a little bit may have been a result of students being given the ability to navigate hierarchies, right, in this liberal framework, without having the tools necessarily, the power or the desire to interrupt those hierarchies. This is a high-performing school. Students felt a lot of pressure to meet a certain standard of performance, and they kind of were able to use humor, sarcasm, and hyperbole to kind of undermine that hierarchy and signal dissent with it without having to openly critique or call into question those power structures that had placed them in this high-achieving school. So some cross-case themes that emerged out of the analysis are safety, fear of repercussion, and those things kind of go together, and then these concepts of trust and respect. So I'll start with fear and safety, about fear of making mistakes and safety in taking risks. So students use the word safe to describe how they felt about their teachers and their classroom environments in relation to discussion again and again. And here are two examples from Central High School and Global Magnet. Ava said, another thing that she does a really good job of is making kids feel like safe and that they could interject in things. She does a really good job of telling them that it's okay to make mistakes. It's fine, especially in this environment. And Carlos at Global Magnet said, during debates, I'm usually quiet during class. But in this class, I know basically everyone, so I don't mind speaking up and not feeling judged. Because sometimes I know I speak up and I'll say something wrong, and I'll look around and I'll see everyone's face looking like, oh, he said something wrong. Oh, he's dumb. But in this class, Mr. Castile makes us feel safe. All right, so here are some examples of how the concept of safety around making mistakes and taking risks came up in the class. And this was when pressed about what it was that made them feel safe or how they knew they were safe. The idea of forgiveness, of being able to move on without fear of repercussion for their actions or mistakes in the classroom was really important, especially when that was absent. Fear of being wrong, being seen as wrong, or messing up was constructed as the opposite of safety by students. There's a really interesting example of this at Tech Prep here where Alyssa says, so I made a grievous mistake in one of my essays when I wrote that Africa was a country. I just had a total brain slip, and I have never lived it down. People that weren't even there still find a way to make fun of me. Like, it's not that it affects me or anything. I don't care. But I just think I can understand the fear of being wrong. You know what I mean? She talked about like a teacher that she made this mistake in a class, still brings it up even years later. And it's part of her regular high school experience now, is that like everybody knows Alyssa thought that Africa was a country this one time. And so that kind of stuck with her, and that's where that fear of being wrong came from. And now I'll move on a little bit to trust and respect. So finally, students reported across the board that they wanted to feel and be reassured that their teachers actually cared about them as people. They expressed a deep appreciation for the positive presence of a kind, caring, and respectful adult at school. And in many cases, the focus groups that we had together ended with students feeling emotional about how much they respected, admired, and were grateful for their teachers. So this respect really went both ways and was part of that feeling of safety. Overall, students in these open classrooms felt that the positive relationships with their teachers made it easier for them to engage in discussion that was open and authentic. And this is really reflected also in quantitative data that we see, such as from the ongoing ICCS studies, right? This positive, strong relationships between teachers and students are consistently associated with open classroom climate and willingness to have classroom discussions. And that was also very true here in this setting and in this sort of subset of classrooms. So I'll leave you with a few final takeaways. So even in this primarily social constructivist paradigm that teachers are teaching in, there's often room for small radical teacher moves that help sort of subvert hierarchies and privilege alternative ways of knowing in the classroom. Even using best practices in social studies education, the outcomes and student experience still varied widely based on the emotional context and students' willingness to be vulnerable during discussion. In places where teachers were successful attending to their students' feelings and their fears, they tended to have more what appeared to be more respectful and safe discussion environments. And it appeared that positive emotions that students had acted as sort of protective buffers that allowed them to take risks and engage more fully in their classrooms. There's also quite a bit of evidence here that the broader school context and climate matters, that even everything teachers can do to make their classrooms safe, inclusive havens, if students don't feel safe and included in the school beyond the classroom, that can have real repercussions for their ability to have meaningful discussions in individual classrooms. And there's some evidence that perhaps developing emotional intelligence in teachers as a part of their regular teacher training could be one lever to help improve classroom discussion climates overall. So I will stop there. I think that's about 20 minutes and make some time for discussion.
That's great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Kelly. That was great. I will stop the recording.